Hello and welcome to the 69th edition of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's pod is titled Fast Fashion Moves First, Why Circularity Has Become Industrial Strategy. Let's start with Zara and John Galliano. The world's largest fast fashion brand and one of fashion's most recognisable bad boy auteurs made news this week by announcing their collaboration to build a circular fashion model, a plan to reauthor Zara's archives. That sounds like a design story, the sort of thing fashion media can dine out on for a week and then move on. We are not going there. The live issue here is regulation, the pressure point is timing, and the deeper system problem is that circularity has quietly stopped being a virtue signal and become an operating model. In apparel now, compliance is moving out of the sustainability report and straight into margin, inventory, logistics, sourcing, data architecture, and capital allocation. The EU ban on destroying unsold apparel, clothing, accessories, and footwear takes effect on July 19th, 2026. That is 86 days away. Then you move into 2027, when textiles sit in the first eco-design for sustainable products regulation implementation wave, and the digital product passport stops being conference wallpaper and starts turning into product-level obligations through delegated acts. Then, by spring 2028, EU member states are meant to have textile extended producer responsibility schemes up and running, which means producers paying for the end-of-life burden of the garments they place on the market. Put those three dates together and the commercial picture sharpens very fast. Unsold inventory loses its old cheap exit. Product data becomes an industrial requirement. End-of-life cost stops being somebody else's problem. Once you internalize that triangle, the Zara move reads differently. This is not Inditex, that is Zara's parent company, suddenly finding religion. It is Inditex reading a rulebook, understanding what kind of cost base Europe is about to create, and moving before the queue forms. That is what sophisticated operators do. They do not wait for the regulation to become painful in lived experience. They price it early, build ahead of it, and try to turn compliance into a moat. And here is the uncomfortable bit for the rest of the sector. Regulation of this kind favours scale and applied technology. Reverse logistics, resale platforms, repair networks, digital traceability, sorting partnerships, materials testing, design system changes, recycler offtakes, compliance staff, data standards, passport infrastructure, legal review, supplier onboarding, all of that has a fixed cost character before it has a per-unit character. If you are Inditex, you can spread those costs across a huge base of units, suppliers, stores, platforms, and markets. If you are a mid-tier brand or a small manufacturer with weaker systems, the same regulation lands less like reform and more like a very expensive admin note from Brussels, with teeth. We should be honest here. This is a consolidation story as much as a sustainability story. Brussels may talk in the language of circularity and consumer information. The market will translate a lot of it into costs of compliance, capital, delay, and opacity. The brands that own infrastructure will amortize it. The brands that do not will pay for access to somebody else's. That is why the applause line about circular fashion needs to be handled carefully. The morally satisfying version of the story is that regulation civilizes the industry. The harder version is that regulation also entrenches the operators best equipped to industrialize compliance. One of the sharpest operators in the sustainable garment manufacturing sector is Pramod Kumar, CEO of Vibemiss Global. In our view, one of the industry pioneers who has treated sustainability as a factory system problem rather than a marketing adjective. His point is simple and exactly right. Sustainable manufacturing does not cost more because it is green. It costs more only when the system is inefficient. If you cut fabric better, automate where the process benefits, reduce defects, and build a replenishment model instead of flooding the market with speculative volume, the cost per sold unit comes down. Pramod is right because the new regime punishes inefficiency with unusual honesty. Overproduction used to be hidden by discounting, liquidation, messy exports, and waste. Europe is shutting those side doors one by one. That is also why Zara's existing circular stack matters more than the Galliano headline on its own. Zara Pre-Owned already gives the brand repairs, peer-to-peer resale and donation channels in a wide set of key markets. Inditex says it has reached its goal of bringing circularity services, such as Zara Pre-Owned, into key markets, and the current service footprint spans 16 European markets and the United States. On top of that sits the clothing collection program, with more than 90 local community organizations. Strip away the branding for a moment and look at what that actually is. It is reverse logistics, together with collection infrastructure, customer habit formation, as well as a first pass at sortation and redistribution. In other words, it is exactly the kind of plumbing you want in place before the destruction ban closes the old disposal route. That is why we think the Galliano part of this story is interesting in a very specific way. Public reporting describes the deal as a 2-year creative partnership in which Galliano will reauthor Zara's archives. Fine. On the surface, that is a design collaboration. Under the hood, it points to a more serious industrial question. What happens when design authority is aimed at circularity constraints rather than pure novelty? Because circularity in garments is decided embarrassingly early. Fibre choice, trim selection, blended composition, dye chemistry, seam construction, labels, coatings, buttons, zips, elastane percentages, all the fiddly things that sound boring until you try to recycle them at scale. By the time a garment reaches end of life, most of its downstream options have already been narrowed by design decisions made months or years earlier. That is where the premium meets mass market tension becomes useful. Couture and luxury have long understood authorship, longevity, repair, alteration, and reworking. Fast fashion has understood speed, replenishment, scale, and distribution. Put those capabilities into the same conversation, and you get something more interesting than a celebrity capsule. You get a chance to engineer circularity at the design stage and then push it through a machine that can distribute and retrieve product at scale. That is the strategic possibility here. One archive-based collaboration does not solve apparel waste, obviously, but it does tell you where the smart money thinks the next compliance advantage lives. There is still a large missing piece, though, and this is where the circularity hype tends to outrun industrial reality. Resale, repairs, and redistribution all extend product life. None of those closes the material loop on their own. Fibre-to-fibre recycling is still the hard bit, especially once you leave the comforting simplicity of monomaterial garments and move into the real wardrobe, where polycotton blends, elastane, coatings, mixed trims, and inconsistent waste streams make everything uglier. That is a picture that points to a mismatch. Real progress, engineering, and money, and still nowhere near enough scaled capacity to absorb the waste mountain the industry already generates. Inditex understands that gap, which is why it has been placing a series of bets rather than waiting for one silver bullet. That is what serious preparation looks like in this sector now. You do not sit in a workshop talking about future circularity. You reserve supply, fund pilots, test collections, build internal capability, and learn where the chemistry fails. Bottom line is that the destruction ban without enough fibre-to-fibre capacity creates a nasty interim problem. The risk is that waste just changes postcode. It moves from incinerators to warehouses, from one jurisdiction to another, from formal disposal into murkier channels, or back into discount systems dressed up as circularity. This is where the industry needs a little less triumphal language and a little more engineering discipline. Collection without recycling capacity is a holding pattern. Repair without design change is a partial fix. Resale without product durability becomes a short second life for low-quality goods. Circularity only becomes structural when design, logistics, data, and recycling capacity start lining up. That brings us to the EU's digital product passports, which in our view are about to make greenwashing harder in one respect and more sophisticated in another. Harder because product-level traceability raises the floor for credible claims. If a garment carries a verifiable data layer, marketing teams lose some of their freedom to improvise. The old game of stitching together a few certifications, a vague recycled content claim, and a green-looking ad campaign starts to look thin once regulators, platforms, customs authorities, and eventually customers can inspect the product trail with more precision. More sophisticated because the winners will be the firms that turn data into operational visibility rather than compliance theatre. Vaibhav Kumar's framing is, again, useful here. His definition of sustainable is operational. Can you trace the product end to end? Can you reduce waste at the production stage? Can you avoid overproduction? If those are not solved, the label does not mean much. That is blunt, but Pramod is again correct. It is also the right order of battle. The US market has already given everyone a tutorial in hard traceability through the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act, which was passed in 2021 and prohibited importing goods into the US from China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. When custom officials ask for supply chain tracing across the production stages, it stops being a branding exercise and becomes market access. Europe is moving on a parallel track with different instruments and a broader circular economy logic. The lesson is the same. Compliance built in from day one is cheaper than compliance bolted on in panic. This is also where the sourcing map starts to change. Vaibhav's experience from the factory and sourcing side shows that the industry is diversifying away from overdependence on China, even if China remains indispensable in several categories. Europe is pulling work closer to home and in parts of Eastern Europe because speed, flexibility, and traceability start to matter more when regulation bites harder and demand cycles stay jumpy. The US still leans on Asia, though with more selectivity and more due diligence. India sits in a strong position for cotton and scalable production if it can keep building the traceability and process discipline global buyers now need. The category picture is just as revealing. Activewear and synthetics will keep growing because the demand is real and the performance characteristics are hard to replace. Yet, sustainability there is still in a messy adolescence. Reuters reported this year that 98% of recycled polyester still comes from plastic bottles rather than true textile-to-textile loops. That tells you two things at once. First, the demand for better synthetic pathways is huge. Second, the actual circular infrastructure for synthetic apparel remains thin. Denim and cotton are in a better position to move towards more circular models, though blends, finishes, and hardware keep causing trouble. The losers are exactly who Vaibhav says they are, the slow, bulk-driven factories and suppliers who still think speed, transparency, and compliance are somebody else's headache. For apparel, that means nearshoring is increasingly an energy story as well as a freight story. If European brands want lower carbon, faster turn, more traceable production, there are options within the EU that have a credible case, notably in the Czech Republic. For those of us who watch project pipelines, that means garment manufacturing demand can reinforce renewable generation, grid upgrades, and industrial decarbonisation in one go. That is much more interesting than a generic nearshoring trend slide. Now, step back and look at what all of this says about the industry hierarchy. The category the market has spent years blaming for disposability is, at least in parts of Europe, moving faster on circular operating infrastructure than many premium players. That is the provocation in this episode, and it is not comfortable. Premium groups can produce beautiful sustainability reports. They can pilot craft-led repair programs, selective resale, capsule upcycling, and responsible sourcing standards. Good. Some of that work is serious. But too often, the premium end still looks stronger in storytelling than in scaled circular plumbing. Inditex, for all the baggage the fast fashion label carries, is building the less glamorous machinery. Resale rails, take-back rails, material startup offtakes, digital systems, and now design experiments that sit closer to industrial circularity than to image management. That does not make Zara the hero of fashion sustainability. Let us keep our heads. The volumes are still enormous. The business model still depends on moving a lot of products. The environmental footprint of the sector remains brutal. What it does mean is that the centre of gravity has shifted. Circularity is being absorbed into strategy by the companies that know how to industrialise processes quickly. The joke, slightly cruel and entirely apt, is that the segment accused of polluting fashion may end up building some of the infrastructure that keeps the rest of it cleaner. And that leaves investors with a much clearer screen than the public conversation often suggests. The defensible assets in apparel now look increasingly obvious. Resale platforms with real liquidity and repair economics. Reverse logistics and sortation infrastructure. Digital product passport and traceability software that can survive regulatory scrutiny. Fibre-to-fibre recycling businesses with chemistry that works outside the pilot plant and unit economics that do not collapse at commercial scale. Integrated manufacturers with visible supply chains, replenishment capability, and access to cleaner power. Those are assets that can pick up value as the rulebook tightens. A lot of everything else is a margin compression story wearing a green badge. The deeper strategic tension, though, is worth ending on. Europe is trying to clean up a dirty system. Fair enough. The mechanism it has chosen will reward discipline, transparency, infrastructure, and scale. Also, fair enough. The problem is that those qualities are unevenly distributed. So, the transition will not only separate serious operators from lazy ones, it will also separate the capitalized from the squeezed, the integrated from the fragmented, the data-rich from the data-poor. Some people will celebrate that as market discipline. Some will call it concentration risk dressed as sustainability. Both readings have a point. For us, the takeaway is clear. Circularity in garments has moved out of the ethics annex and into industrial strategy. The Zara Galliano tie-up is a useful signal because it makes that shift visible in one strange, memorable image. Couture authorship crossing into fast fashion scale just as Europe starts pricing waste, data, and end-of-life responsibility far more aggressively. Operators like Vibermist are there to blaze the forward path, to provide the manufacturing systems and technology to spread the benefits of circularity. There is no trophy for being morally indignant and operationally late. The brands and manufacturers that build the infrastructure now will shape the cost curve later. Everyone else will spend the next few years discovering that compliance is a terrible substitute for strategy. Well, that's a wrap on our 69th GreenWave podcast episode. Thank you for your time and for riding with us through a topic that is about to become a lot less niche and a lot more financial. You can find the GreenWave podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. Please follow the show, share the episode with colleagues, and leave us a review if you think the argument deserves a wider airing. You can also keep up with us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, and at synergy-international.net. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.